In the deepest corners of North American wilderness, something has been watching us for thousands of years. Native tribes spoke of it in hushed whispers. Miners fled their claims because of it. Today, over 10,000 reported sightings exist in databases across the continent. The FBI has a file on it. Scientists have analyzed its hair. Hollywood has immortalized it. Yet officially, it doesn't exist. But what if the greatest mystery in North America isn't whether Bigfoot is real, but why we've been covering up the truth about what it really is? Tonight, we're going to take you on a journey through time, following a trail of evidence that spans centuries, connecting ancient legends to modern encounters in ways you never imagined. By the end of this investigation, you'll never look at the American wilderness the same way again. This is the untold history of Bigfoot. Long before Europeans set foot on North American soil, the forests already had a guardian, or perhaps a prisoner. Indigenous peoples across the continent, from the Lummi of Washington to the Choctaw of Mississippi, shared remarkably similar stories about massive, hair-covered beings that walked upright through their ancestral lands. The Lakota called them Chietanka, the big elder brother. To the Ojibwe, they were Wendigo, beings caught between the world of spirits and flesh. The Quinault spoke of Seiteko, forest giants who could speak, but chose silence. What's fascinating isn't just that these cultures shared similar legends, but that they shared them across vast distances, long before any contact with each other. Dr. Grover Krantz, the late Washington State University anthropologist who dedicated his career to cryptozoology, once noted something remarkable about these ancient accounts. Unlike other mythological creatures that varied wildly between tribes, descriptions of these forest beings remained stunningly consistent. Height estimates centered around 8 to 9 feet. Hair color ranged from dark brown to black. Behavior patterns involved avoiding human contact while occasionally stealing food or tools. And most intriguing of all, these weren't described as monsters or demons, but as another type of people. The Hopi have a creation story that might explain why. According to their oral tradition, during the Great Migration from the Third World to the Fourth, not all beings made the journey successfully. Some were left behind, transformed, forced to adapt to life in the deep wilderness. These beings retained their intelligence, but lost their connection to human society. They became the guardians of the forests, the watchers in the woods. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. In 1924, a team of archaeologists working in Nevada's Lovelock Cave made a discovery that would haunt the scientific community for decades. They uncovered the mummified remains of red-haired giants, some measuring over 8 feet tall, with skulls significantly larger than modern humans. Local Paiute tribes weren't surprised. Their legends spoke of the Siteka, red-haired giants who once ruled the area before being driven into the caves by their ancestors. The Smithsonian Institution quickly acquired these remains, and they disappeared into storage, never to be publicly displayed or studied. When questioned about the giants, museum officials claimed the measurements were exaggerated and the remains were simply tall Native Americans. But the Paiute knew better. They remembered the war against the giants, fought generations before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing west. Similar discoveries emerged throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Giant skeletal remains were reportedly found in Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and California. Newspaper accounts from the 1800s regularly reported the discovery of human-like remains of extraordinary size. Yet these discoveries seemed to vanish as quickly as they were found, leaving only newspaper clippings and local legends behind. What happened to this evidence? Some researchers suggest a systematic cover-up, orchestrated to preserve accepted theories of human evolution and migration. Others propose that these discoveries were misidentified or exaggerated by untrained observers. But Native American oral traditions suggest a third possibility, one that modern science is only beginning to consider. What if these weren't separate species, but branches of the same family tree? What if the beings we now call Bigfoot are the descendants of these ancient giants, survivors who retreated deeper into the wilderness as human civilization expanded? The genetic isolation would explain the continued sightings, the consistent physical descriptions, and the intelligent behavior that sets these creatures apart from other cryptids. Consider this. Native American pictographs found throughout the Pacific Northwest don't just show humans and animals. They show three distinct types of humanoid figures: normal-sized humans, smaller figures that might represent children or a different group, and massive upright figures with pronounced muscle definition and body hair. These aren't artistic interpretations or spiritual symbols. They appear to be documentation, historical records carved in stone. The most compelling evidence comes from the oral histories themselves. Unlike mythology, which tends to become more fantastical over time, these stories have remained remarkably consistent across generations. Elders from different tribes, speaking different languages, separated by hundreds of miles, describe the same creatures in the same ways. They speak of beings who know human language but rarely use it, who understand fire but don't make it, who craft simple tools but live without permanent shelter. These weren't gods or demons in tribal tradition. They were neighbors, distant neighbors who preferred to remain hidden, but neighbors nonetheless. Some tribes even have protocols for encounters, specific behaviors to show respect, ways to avoid conflict, methods for leaving offerings that might prevent theft or territorial disputes. The Makah tribe of the Olympic Peninsula maintains that their ancestors regularly encountered these beings during salmon runs. The giants would wait downstream, collecting fish that escaped the tribal nets. It was an arrangement that worked for both sides. The Makah got their salmon, and the giants got theirs, without direct confrontation. But as European diseases decimated tribal populations and industrial logging began clearing the forests, these careful balances were disrupted. By the mid-1800s, the old agreements were breaking down. The survivors of both communities found themselves competing for increasingly scarce resources. This is when the first monster sightings began appearing in European American accounts. What had been neighbors were now being encountered by people who had no cultural context for understanding what they were seeing. The year was 1847, and California gold fever was about to change everything. Prospectors poured into the Sierra Nevada mountains, pickaxes and gold pans in hand, dreams of fortune burning in their hearts. They expected to face claim jumpers, harsh weather, and dangerous animals. They never expected to encounter something that would challenge their understanding of the natural world. The first documented European American sighting occurred near what is now Auburn, California. Thomas Winters, a 49er from Missouri, was working a claim along Bear Creek when something massive emerged from the tree line. In a letter to his wife, preserved in the California State Archives, Winters described a creature that stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with arms that reached almost to its knees. But Winters wasn't alone. Within months, similar reports began flooding into mining camps throughout the region. The creatures were stealing tools, raiding food supplies, and occasionally throwing rocks at miners who ventured too close to certain areas. The local Maidu tribe nodded knowingly when miners shared their stories. Their people had always known to avoid certain valleys, certain groves where the forest people lived. What makes these early accounts particularly credible is their matter-of-fact tone. These were practical men, focused on extracting wealth from the earth. They had no incentive to fabricate elaborate monster stories that might scare away investors or make them appear unreliable. Their letters home and journal entries read like business reports, noting the creature's presence as simply another challenge to overcome, like difficult terrain or harsh weather. Jean-Baptiste, a French-Canadian fur trapper who had spent decades in the wilderness, offered a different perspective. In 1851, he claimed to have observed a family group of these creatures from a concealed position. He watched them for several hours, noting their use of crude tools to extract grubs from rotting logs. Their method of communication, through low-pitched vocalizations, and their apparent social structure centered around a dominant male and multiple females with young. Baptiste's account, recorded by a traveling journalist, provides details that wouldn't become common knowledge until modern primatology studies decades later. He described behaviors consistent with advanced primate social structures: grooming activities, food sharing, protective positioning of young during movement, and territorial marking through scent and sound. The most significant encounter of this period occurred in 1855 near what is now Yosemite National Park. A party of surveyors mapping potential railroad routes reported being stalked by a group of hair-covered giants for 3 days. The creatures remained just beyond rifle range, but clearly paralleled the surveyor's route, occasionally throwing stones to announce their presence. On the third night, the creatures approached the camp. According to the official report filed with the Central Pacific Railroad Company, the largest creature, estimated at over 8 feet tall, entered the firelight and began examining their equipment. It showed particular interest in metal tools, testing their weight and balance before setting them aside. The creature made no aggressive moves, but clearly communicated through gestures that the surveyors should leave the area. The survey team complied, marking their maps with warnings about hostile wildlife in the region. But one surveyor, James Marshall, kept a private journal with more detailed observations. Marshall noted the creature's obvious intelligence, its careful examination of human technology, and its apparent understanding of the survey team's purpose. The creature hadn't acted like an animal defending territory. It had acted like a landowner asking trespassers to move along. These encounters established patterns that continue in modern sightings. The creatures appeared most frequently in areas where human activity disrupted established routines, mining claims that blocked traditional travel routes, logging operations that eliminated food sources, or survey expeditions that mapped previously undisturbed territories. Rather than random monster attacks, these seemed to be calculated responses to territorial intrusion. The mining community developed unofficial protocols for dealing with the creatures. Certain areas were abandoned, not because gold wasn't present, but because the costs of constant harassment weren't worth the potential profits. Some miners reported leaving portions of their food supplies in designated locations, finding that this reduced theft and property damage. Others learned to recognize territorial markers, stacked stones, broken branches arranged in specific patterns, or the distinctive smell that seemed to precede encounters. By 1860, the California mining community had largely accepted the creature's existence as a fact of frontier life. Local newspapers regularly reported encounters without sensationalism, treating them as wildlife management issues rather than supernatural events. The Sacramento Union ran a series of practical articles titled "Living with the Forest Giants," offering advice on storage techniques, camp security, and territorial awareness. But as mining operations grew larger and more mechanized, these informal arrangements began breaking down. Hydraulic mining destroyed entire watersheds, eliminating the privacy these creatures required. Railroad construction carved permanent scars through previously remote territories. The flexible coexistence that had developed between individual miners and the creatures couldn't survive industrial-scale resource extraction. The creatures began withdrawing deeper into the wilderness, seeking areas where human presence remained minimal. This retreat established the pattern that continues today. Sightings concentrated in remote forests, national parks, and other areas where development remains limited. They weren't disappearing. They were adapting their territory to maintain the isolation that seems essential to their survival. The final major encounter of the Gold Rush era occurred in 1867 as railroad construction reached its peak. A Central Pacific work crew reported being systematically harassed while building a trestle bridge across a canyon in the Sierra Nevada. Tools disappeared nightly, survey stakes were pulled up, and workers reported feeling watched whenever they entered the canyon. The harassment escalated when construction began disturbing a grove of ancient trees at the canyon's head. Workers reported hearing vocalizations that sounded almost like human crying, emanating from the grove at night. On 3 separate occasions, massive boulders were rolled down the canyon walls, barely missing work crews and equipment. The railroad company brought in armed guards and considered using dynamite to clear the grove entirely. But before they could implement these plans, the harassment stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Workers entering the grove found it empty, with no sign of whatever had been living there. The trees remained standing, but the presence was gone. Local Washoe tribe members weren't surprised. They explained that the grove had been a sacred site for the forest people, a place where they gathered for important ceremonies. The creatures had protected it as long as possible, but when faced with overwhelming force, they had simply moved their ceremonies elsewhere. The railroad got its bridge, but at a cost that wouldn't be understood for generations. Something strange happened to Bigfoot between 1870 and 1950. After decades of regular encounters during the Gold Rush era, the creatures seemed to vanish from public consciousness. Sightings didn't stop. They continued at a steady pace throughout this period. But society stopped paying attention. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping America, and there was little room for forest mysteries in a world focused on factories, cities, and technological progress. But the creatures were still there, and some people were still watching. Dr. David Paulides, a former police investigator turned researcher, spent years combing through archives from this period. What he found suggests that the absence of public reports didn't mean an absence of encounters. Government agencies, timber companies, and remote communities continued documenting sightings, but these reports were filed away rather than publicized. Someone or some organization seemed determined to keep these encounters out of mainstream awareness. The Civilian Conservation Corps, established during the Great Depression, provides a fascinating window into this hidden period. Between 1933 and 1942, the CCC employed over 3 million young men in forest conservation projects across the country. They built trails, planted trees, and spent months in remote wilderness areas where few civilians ever ventured. Their daily reports, archived in the National Archives, contain dozens of references to encounters with unidentified, large wildlife that defied easy classification. That's it. CCC worker Robert Chen, stationed in Olympic National Forest in 1936, kept a personal diary that wasn't discovered until his family donated his papers to a historical society in 1998. Chen's entries describe a creature that visited his work camp regularly, always at dawn, always approaching from the same direction. The creature would observe the workers from a distance, occasionally mimicking their activities by stacking logs or clearing brush in nearby areas. Chen's supervisor initially dismissed these reports, but after several weeks of consistent sightings, he began his own observations. His official reports describe the creature as approximately 8 feet in height, bipedal locomotion, extensive body hair, and demonstrating behavioral patterns inconsistent with known wildlife species. The supervisor recommended further study, but his reports were classified and filed without action. This pattern repeats throughout CCC records. Workers reported encounters, supervisors documented them, and the reports disappeared into bureaucratic filing systems. The official explanation was national security. During World War II, any unusual activity in forest areas was considered potentially relevant to enemy infiltration or sabotage. But the classification continued long after the war ended, suggesting other motivations. The timber industry tells a similar story. Logging camps throughout the Pacific Northwest reported regular encounters during this period. But company policies discouraged public discussion. Weyerhaeuser, one of the largest timber companies, maintained internal files on unusual wildlife encounters that weren't made public until litigation forced their release in the 1990s. These files contain hundreds of reports from logging crews, describing creatures that seemed to follow timber operations, appearing whenever old-growth forests were being cleared. The pattern suggests intelligence and purpose. The creatures weren't randomly appearing in logging areas. They were monitoring specific operations, particularly those targeting the oldest and most remote forest stands. Loggers reported that the creatures seemed most active when cutting reached certain areas, almost as if they were trying to protect particular groves or watersheds. Red Emerson, whose family has run logging operations in Northern California for over a century, shared stories passed down through generations of workers. His grandfather spoke of creatures that would stand at the edge of clear cuts, watching the destruction with what could only be described as grief. They never interfered directly, but their presence was a constant reminder that humans weren't alone in the forest. The most intriguing accounts from this period come from fire lookout stations scattered throughout western wilderness areas. Fire lookouts spent months in isolation, positioned to observe vast stretches of forest from elevated towers. Their job required careful attention to any movement or change in the landscape below. Many reported observing large, upright figures moving through distant valleys, traveling in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. Martha Williams operated a fire lookout in Montana's Glacier National Park from 1938 to 1952. Her observation logs, preserved in the park archives, contain detailed descriptions of creatures she observed regularly throughout her tenure. Williams noted their seasonal movement patterns, their apparent family groups, and their sophisticated understanding of terrain and weather. She reported that they seemed to use established travel routes that avoided human presence while connecting distant forest areas. Williams also documented something that wouldn't be understood until decades later: the creature's apparent communication network. She observed instances where activity in one valley would be followed by movement in distant areas within hours, suggesting some form of long-distance communication. This could explain how the creatures managed to avoid human contact so effectively despite increasing development pressure. The military provides another piece of this puzzle. During World War II, remote military installations reported encounters with unidentified creatures, but these reports were classified at the highest levels. The official justification involved national security, but declassified documents suggest that military leadership was genuinely unsure how to handle encounters with unknown intelligent species. Colonel James Harrison, stationed at a radar installation in Washington's Olympic Mountains, filed reports describing creatures that seemed to observe military activities with obvious intelligence. The creatures would position themselves to watch exercises and equipment tests, maintaining distances that suggested understanding of weapons ranges and detection capabilities. Harrison's reports recommended establishing communication protocols, but his suggestions were overruled by higher command. Perhaps the most significant development during this hidden period was the creature's apparent adaptation to modern technology. Early encounters suggested beings that used only the simplest tools and lived according to prehistoric patterns. But reports from the 1920s and 1930s indicate creatures that had learned to avoid detection by radio equipment, to circumvent motion sensors, and to recognize the threat posed by aircraft and vehicles. This technological awareness suggests not just intelligence, but cultural learning passed between generations. The creatures weren't just hiding from individual humans anymore. They were hiding from human civilization as a whole, understanding its capabilities and limitations well enough to remain invisible despite increasing surveillance and development. The period also saw the first attempts at organized scientific study. Dr. Ivan Sanderson, a respected naturalist and television personality, began collecting encounter reports in the 1940s, recognizing patterns that suggested an unknown species rather than folklore or misidentification. Sanderson's research was funded privately and conducted discreetly, avoiding the publicity that might have complicated his mainstream scientific career. Sanderson identified what he called the North American ape as a likely relict hominid, a surviving member of an evolutionary branch thought extinct. His research suggested that these creatures had successfully adapted to life in modern wilderness areas by developing sophisticated avoidance strategies and flexible behavioral patterns. They weren't primitive throwbacks, but highly evolved survivors who had learned to thrive in the margins of human civilization. But Sanderson's research was interrupted by his death in 1973, and his files were dispersed among various institutions. Some researchers believe that his most significant findings were deliberately suppressed, either by government agencies concerned about public reaction or by scientific institutions protecting orthodox theories of human evolution. By 1950, a pattern had been established. The creatures continued to exist, continued to be encountered, but official society had agreed to ignore them. Whether this was deliberate policy or unconscious cultural decision remains unclear, but the effect was the same. North America's greatest mystery had been relegated to the shadows, maintained as a secret, shared between those who lived and worked in remote areas. This silence wouldn't last much longer. The post-war boom was bringing unprecedented numbers of people into wilderness areas for recreation, and new technologies were making documentation possible in ways that hadn't existed before. The creatures had managed to remain hidden during the industrial transformation of America, but they were about to face an even greater challenge: the age of mass media and instant communication. October 20th, 1967, a date that would forever divide the world into those who believed and those who refused to consider the possibility. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin, two men seeking fortune and fame in the remote forests of Northern California, captured 59 seconds of 16mm film that would become the most analyzed, debated, and controversial piece of evidence in cryptozoological history. But the Patterson-Gimlin film didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the culmination of years of increasing activity in the Six Rivers National Forest, centered around a remote area called Bluff Creek. Local logging crews had been reporting encounters for years, and the frequency was accelerating. Something was drawing attention to this particular stretch of wilderness, and Patterson believed he knew what it was. The backstory begins in 1958, when bulldozer operator Jerry Crew discovered massive footprints around his work site near Bluff Creek. The prints were larger than any known animal, showing distinct toe impressions and stride lengths that suggested a bipedal creature of enormous size. Crew made plaster casts of the clearest prints and took them to the local newspaper, unwittingly launching modern Bigfoot research. The newspaper story attracted attention from across the country, but it also attracted skeptics. The prints were dismissed as hoaxes by mainstream scientists, despite their consistency and the technical difficulty of creating convincing fake tracks in multiple locations over several months. The skepticism was so intense that Crew eventually stopped talking publicly about his discoveries, but he never recanted his story. Patterson had been researching the creature for years before the famous film was made. A rodeo rider and amateur naturalist, he had written a book about the creature in 1966, collecting accounts from across the Pacific Northwest. His research suggested that the creatures were most active during late fall, when salmon runs brought them closer to river areas. This hypothesis led him to plan his October 1967 expedition to Bluff Creek. The expedition was carefully planned, not a casual camping trip. Patterson brought professional-grade 16mm film equipment, multiple cameras, and plaster casting materials. He was accompanied by Bob Gimlin, an experienced horseman and tracker who could navigate the difficult terrain and provide credible witness testimony. They weren't hoping to stumble across something. They were actively hunting based on research and preparation. The encounter occurred around 1:30 p.m. on a clear autumn day. Patterson and Gimlin were riding along Bluff Creek when their horses became agitated, refusing to proceed further down the trail. They dismounted to investigate and discovered fresh tracks in the creek bed. While examining the prints, they heard movement in the forest ahead. What happened next changed everything. A massive, hair-covered figure emerged from behind a fallen log about 80 feet away. The creature was clearly female, with pronounced breasts and wide hips, standing approximately 7 feet tall. It moved with fluid grace despite its size, glancing back at the men before disappearing into the forest. Patterson managed to film the entire encounter despite his horse throwing him and the difficult conditions. The film shows details that continue to confound skeptics today. The creature's muscle definition is visible beneath its hair coat, showing anatomical accuracy that would have been impossible to fake with 1960s costume technology. Its gait demonstrates a compliant knee pattern unlike human locomotion, suggesting adaptations for carrying significant body weight over rough terrain. The arm length and shoulder width proportions match theoretical reconstructions of bipedal primates, not human anatomy scaled up. Most compelling is what the creature does after noticing the camera. Rather than fleeing immediately, it maintains a steady walking pace, occasionally glancing back at Patterson and Gimlin. This suggests confidence in its ability to escape rather than panic at being discovered. The creature's behavior indicates intelligence and assessment of threat level, not animal fear response. But the film raised as many questions as it answered. Why did the creature appear so conveniently during Patterson's expedition? Why didn't it run immediately upon seeing humans? Why did it allow itself to be filmed from such a relatively close distance? These questions fed skepticism that continues today, despite extensive analysis that has never definitively proven the film fraudulent. Gimlin's testimony adds crucial credibility to the encounter. A experienced outdoorsman with a reputation for honesty, Gimlin had nothing to gain from supporting Patterson's story. In fact, the notoriety damaged his standing in the local community, where many residents preferred to keep their forest mysteries private. Gimlin has never wavered from his account, despite decades of pressure to admit fraud. The immediate aftermath of the film's release was chaotic. Media attention descended on Bluff Creek, bringing both researchers and sensation seekers. The remote area was suddenly crawling with amateur investigators, television crews, and curious tourists. This influx of human activity had an immediate effect. Sightings in the area dropped dramatically and didn't recover for years. This pattern would repeat throughout the Pacific Northwest. Areas with significant Bigfoot activity would suddenly go quiet once they received media attention. The creatures seemed to understand the connection between publicity and increased human presence, adjusting their behavior accordingly. This intelligence suggested something far more sophisticated than the primitive ape-man portrayed in popular culture. Scientific analysis of the Patterson film began almost immediately. Dr. Grover Krantz at Washington State University conducted detailed biomechanical analysis, concluding that the creature's proportions and movement patterns were consistent with an unknown primate species. His analysis focused on details that would have been impossible to fake convincingly: muscle movement under hair, foot flexibility, and locomotion patterns. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, an anatomy professor at Idaho State University, later conducted even more sophisticated analysis using computer modeling and biomechanical reconstruction. His conclusions supported Krantz's findings, noting that the creature's foot structure and gait patterns showed evolutionary adaptations for bipedalism that differed significantly from human adaptations. The creature appeared optimized for forest travel over rough terrain rather than open ground pursuit. But other experts reached different conclusions. Dr. David Daegling, an anthropologist at the University of Florida, argued that the film showed a person in a costume, pointing to what he perceived as human-like movement patterns and proportional relationships. The debate became heated, with careers and reputations at stake on both sides. The controversy was complicated by Patterson's background as a showman and entrepreneur. He had previously been involved in rodeo promotion and other ventures that required marketing skills and public relations awareness. Critics suggested that the film was an elaborate hoax designed to promote his book and generate income from lecture tours and media appearances. However, analysis of Patterson's financial records and timeline suggests that if the film was a hoax, it was an expensive one. The expedition cost significant money. The film equipment was professional grade, and the remote location required considerable time and effort to reach. If Patterson was seeking easy money, there were far simpler ways to achieve it than trekking into the wilderness with heavy camera equipment. The film's technical aspects also argue against simple fraud. The creature's hair moves naturally in wind currents, showing individual strand movement that would be extremely difficult to achieve with artificial fur. The creature's breathing is visible through chest movement, and its breasts move naturally during locomotion. These details suggest either genuine footage of an unknown creature or special effects capabilities far beyond what was available to independent filmmakers in 1967. Perhaps most significantly, the film established a template for future encounters. The creature's physical characteristics, movement patterns, and behavior became the standard against which later sightings were measured. This consistency across thousands of reports from people who couldn't have coordinated their stories suggests either a genuine species or a cultural phenomenon so powerful that it shapes perception and memory. The Patterson film also marked the beginning of modern Bigfoot research as an organized field of study. Research organizations formed, standardized reporting procedures were developed, and systematic investigation techniques were established. The amateur approach of earlier decades gave way to more sophisticated methods borrowed from primatology, anthropology, and wildlife biology. But the increased attention came with costs. The creatures themselves seemed to respond to publicity by becoming more elusive, making future documentation even more difficult. The Bluff Creek area, once a hotspot of activity, became increasingly quiet as media attention persisted. The creatures appeared to understand that their survival depended on maintaining secrecy, and they adjusted their behavior accordingly. This intelligence would prove to be both their greatest asset and the greatest challenge for researchers trying to prove their existence. The creatures weren't just hiding from humans, they were actively evading discovery by a species that had developed increasingly sophisticated detection and communication technologies. The game of hide and seek had entered a new phase, with stakes higher than ever before. What does the United States government really know about Bigfoot? For decades, this question lingered in the realm of conspiracy theories and late-night speculation. Then, in 1977, the FBI released a document that changed everything. It was a single page marked "Confidential," addressed to the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The subject line read simply, "Bigfoot." The document was a response to Peter Burns, director of the Bigfoot Information Center, who had requested FBI analysis of hair samples allegedly from an unknown creature. The FBI's response was remarkable, not for what it revealed, but for what it confirmed. The federal government was taking the Bigfoot phenomenon seriously enough to conduct laboratory analysis and maintain official files. The analyzed hair samples were found to be from the deer family, disappointing to researchers, but significant in demonstrating that the FBI possessed both the capability and willingness to investigate cryptozoological evidence. But this single-release document raised more questions than it answered. If the FBI was willing to analyze hair samples, what other investigations were being conducted? What other files existed? The answer began emerging through Freedom of Information Act requests filed throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Government agencies from the Department of Interior to the Army Corps of Engineers possessed files related to unexplained creature sightings. Most documents were heavily redacted, but the patterns suggested systematic monitoring and investigation far beyond casual interest. The National Park Service emerged as particularly significant in this hidden history. Internal documents revealed that park rangers across the country were required to file reports on any unusual wildlife encounters that didn't match known species. These reports were forwarded to regional headquarters and, in some cases, to Washington, D.C. The official justification involved wildlife management and visitor safety, but the level of detail required suggested other purposes. Ranger Kevin Jones, who worked in Olympic National Park from 1978 to 2003, described the reporting procedures in interviews after his retirement. Any encounter with unidentified large mammals required detailed documentation, including location coordinates, time of observation, weather conditions, creature behavior, and estimated measurements. The reports were classified and filed separately from normal wildlife observations. Jones recalled several encounters during his career that required these special reports. In 1982, he observed a family group of large, bipedal creatures crossing a meadow in the park's interior. The creatures moved in single file, with adults flanking what appeared to be juveniles. They showed clear awareness of his presence, but didn't flee, suggesting familiarity with human observers rather than fear. The creatures' behavior indicated sophisticated territorial awareness. They followed established routes that avoided popular hiking areas, while connecting distant water sources and seasonal food locations. Their movement patterns suggested detailed knowledge of the park's geography and seasonal changes, accumulated over generations of living in the same area. But Jones's most significant observation involved the creature's apparent understanding of human technology. During a backcountry patrol in 1987, he discovered that motion-activated trail cameras had been systematically disabled in a remote area where creature sign was regularly observed. The cameras hadn't been destroyed, but carefully repositioned to monitor empty spaces rather than active game trails. This technological awareness suggested intelligence far beyond animal instinct. The creatures understood the purpose of surveillance equipment and possessed the manual dexterity to manipulate it without causing damage. They weren't just avoiding human contact, they were actively managing human ability to document their presence. The military's involvement in Bigfoot research runs much deeper than most people realize. Declassified documents reveal that various branches of the armed forces have conducted studies related to unknown hominid encounters since at least the 1940s. The official justification involved understanding all potential factors that might affect military operations in wilderness areas. During the Cold War, remote military installations regularly reported encounters with unidentified creatures. These reports were taken seriously because security was paramount. Any unknown presence near sensitive installations required investigation. The creatures seemed drawn to military facilities, possibly due to the roads and clearings that provided easier travel routes through otherwise difficult terrain. Major Robert Thompson, who commanded a radar installation in Alaska from 1963 to 1967, filed regular reports about large, bipedal creatures observed near the facility. The creatures showed obvious intelligence, positioning themselves to observe military activities while remaining beyond effective weapons range. They seemed particularly interested in supply deliveries and equipment installations, watching from concealed positions during daylight operations. Thompson's reports recommended attempting communication with the creatures, noting their apparent intelligence and non-threatening behavior. He suggested that they might be willing to share information about terrain and weather conditions in exchange for limited access to areas around the installation. His suggestions were rejected by higher command, but the reports continued throughout his tenure. The most intriguing military documents involve special forces training exercises in remote areas. Multiple reports describe encounters between training units and unknown creatures that seem to observe military tactics and procedures. The creatures would shadow training exercises, maintaining distances that suggested understanding of weapons capabilities, while demonstrating obvious interest in military activities. In 1971, a Special Forces unit conducting survival training in Washington's Cascade Range reported being stalked by large bipedal creatures for 3 days. The creatures paralleled the unit's route, occasionally throwing stones to announce their presence, but never approaching close enough for clear observation. The unit commander noted that the creatures seemed to be learning from watching military procedures, adapting their own stalking techniques based on human tactics. These military encounters suggest that the creatures possessed sophisticated understanding of human capabilities and limitations. They recognized threats, understood technology, and demonstrated tactical thinking that went far beyond animal intelligence. This raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of these beings and their relationship to human society. The Central Intelligence Agency's involvement remains largely classified, but released documents confirm that the agency has investigated reports of unknown hominid species in various parts of the world. The justification involved understanding local populations and environmental factors that might affect agency operations, but the level of interest suggests deeper concerns. CIA documents from the 1960s describe encounters with unidentified hominid species in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Military advisors reported creatures that seemed to observe military activities, particularly special operations in remote areas. The creatures were described as larger than humans, covered in hair, and demonstrating intelligence that made them potentially valuable sources of information about terrain and enemy activities. These international parallels suggest that the North American phenomenon might be part of a global pattern. Encounters with large, intelligent, hair-covered hominids have been reported from every continent except Antarctica. The consistency of descriptions across cultures and continents implies either a worldwide species or a shared element of human psychology that manifests in remarkably similar ways. The Department of Agriculture's Forest Service maintains extensive files on unexplained encounters in national forests. These documents, released through FOIA requests, reveal systematic monitoring of creature activity and its impact on forest ecosystems. The official concern involves understanding all factors that affect forest health and visitor safety. But the documentation suggests broader interests. Forest Service reports describe creatures that seem to play important roles in forest ecosystems. They appear to disperse seeds over long distances, create clearings that benefit other wildlife, and maintain trails that are used by multiple species. Their presence seems to indicate healthy forest conditions, while their absence may signal environmental problems that require attention. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a Forest Service biologist who worked in the Pacific Northwest from 1985 to 2010, described the official policy toward creature encounters. Rangers were instructed to document all unusual observations, but not to discuss them publicly. The reasoning involved preventing sensationalism that might interfere with serious research. But the secrecy also protected government agencies from ridicule and controversy. Mitchell's own encounters challenged her scientific training and worldview. In 1992, while conducting a wildlife survey in a remote area of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, she observed a large, bipedal creature methodically harvesting huckleberries from bushes, approximately 200 yards away. The creature's behavior suggested intelligence and purpose. It selected only ripe berries, handled the branches carefully to avoid damage, and moved through the patch in a systematic pattern that maximized efficiency while minimizing impact on the plants. What struck Mitchell most was the creature's apparent understanding of sustainable harvesting practices. It took only a portion of berries from each bush, leaving enough for the plant's health and for other wildlife. This suggested not just intelligence, but ecological awareness that many humans lack. The creature wasn't just surviving in the forest. It was actively participating in maintaining the ecosystem's health. The most significant revelation in government files involves the National Security Agency's monitoring of Bigfoot-related communications. Declassified documents reveal that the NSA has intercepted and analyzed thousands of phone calls, emails, and radio transmissions related to creature sightings. The official justification involves monitoring for potential hoaxes that might interfere with legitimate government activities. But the scope of surveillance suggests deeper concerns. NSA analysis identified patterns in sighting reports that suggested either coordinated hoaxes or genuine creature migration patterns. Sightings often occurred in clusters, moving across the landscape in ways that followed seasonal patterns and geographic features. These patterns were consistent with large mammal behavior, but occurred across territories far too vast for any known species, except possibly humans. The agency also identified communication networks among researchers and witnesses that seemed to operate according to internal protocols and hierarchies. Information flowed through these networks in ways that suggested organization and purpose beyond casual interest. Some researchers appeared to possess access to information that wasn't available through public channels, suggesting connections to official sources or systematic field research. Perhaps most intriguingly, NSA analysis identified anomalous radio transmissions from remote forest areas that seemed to correlate with creature sighting reports. These transmissions used frequencies and patterns that didn't match any known human activity, but they demonstrated structure and repetition that suggested intelligence. The signals appeared to be some form of communication, but attempts to decode them were unsuccessful. The Department of Defense's involvement extends beyond simple monitoring. Classified documents reveal that military researchers have studied reported creature capabilities to assess potential applications for military technology. The creature's apparent ability to move silently through difficult terrain, avoid technological detection, and demonstrate situational awareness could have significant value for special operations development. Military interest also extends to the creature's apparent social organization and communication methods. If the beings possess sophisticated group coordination abilities, understanding these methods could improve military unit effectiveness. The creatures seem capable of maintaining group cohesion across vast territories without detectable electronic communication, a capability that would be extremely valuable for covert operations. But the most disturbing aspects of government involvement involve apparent cover-up activities. Multiple witnesses have reported being contacted by government agents after filing sighting reports, with requests or demands to cease public discussion of their experiences. These contacts typically involve individuals identifying themselves as federal agents, though their specific agency affiliation is often unclear. Jim Stevens, a retired logger from Oregon, described such a contact following his 1998 encounter with a creature near the Mount Hood National Forest. Within weeks of filing a report with local authorities, Stevens was visited by two men in dark suits who identified themselves as federal agents. They requested that he refrain from discussing his encounter publicly, citing concerns about public safety and potential interference with ongoing research. The agents didn't deny the reality of Stevens' encounter, but they emphasized the importance of preventing panic or sensationalism that might complicate official investigations. They suggested that legitimate research was ongoing, but that public discussion might interfere with scientific progress. Stevens complied with their request, but he never learned which agency they represented or what research they were protecting. Similar contacts have been reported by dozens of witnesses across the country. The pattern suggests systematic monitoring of sighting reports and active efforts to prevent public discussion of encounters. Whether this represents legitimate scientific caution or deliberate cover-up remains unclear, but the effect has been to suppress public awareness of government involvement in creature research. The emergence of these government files raises fundamental questions about official knowledge and public disclosure. If federal agencies have been investigating the Bigfoot phenomenon for decades, what have they discovered? Do they possess evidence that confirms the creature's existence? Are they protecting scientific research or covering up information that might challenge accepted theories about human evolution and North American natural history? The pattern of secrecy and limited disclosure suggests that government agencies know more than they're willing to reveal. Whether this knowledge involves confirmed species identification, ongoing research programs, or simply accumulated evidence that hasn't reached definitive conclusions, the level of interest and resources invested indicates that the phenomenon is being taken far more seriously than public statements suggest. As we move deeper into the digital age, maintaining this secrecy becomes increasingly difficult. Satellite surveillance, motion-activated cameras, and GPS tracking create an environment where truly unknown species become harder to conceal. If these creatures exist, and if government agencies have evidence of their existence, the pressure for disclosure will only increase as technology makes their presence impossible to deny. The year 2007 marked a turning point in Bigfoot research. For the first time in history, ordinary people carried high-resolution cameras in their pockets. Trail cameras became affordable and reliable. Social media platforms allowed instant sharing of encounters and evidence. The age of digital documentation had arrived, and with it, an explosion of potential evidence that would either finally prove the creature's existence or demonstrate the power of modern hoax technology. The first major test came in 2008 with the Georgia Bigfoot hoax. Two men claimed to have discovered the body of a Bigfoot in the North Georgia mountains, presenting what appeared to be compelling photographic evidence. The story went viral, attracting international media attention and spawning television specials. But careful analysis revealed the body to be a costume filled with possum roadkill and ice. The Georgia incident demonstrated both the potential and the pitfalls of digital-age Bigfoot research. Technology made it easier to create convincing fake evidence, but it also made detailed analysis possible in ways that weren't available in earlier decades. High-resolution photography, video enhancement software, and rapid expert analysis could expose hoaxes within days rather than years. But genuine encounters were being documented too. The Pacific Northwest experienced a surge in credible sightings during the 2000s and 2010s, many supported by physical evidence and multiple witnesses. These cases shared common characteristics that set them apart from obvious hoaxes. Multiple forms of evidence, credible witnesses with nothing to gain from fabrication, and details that suggested genuine encounters rather than staged events. The Olympic Peninsula became a particular focus of activity. The remote forests of Olympic National Park provided ideal habitat for large, elusive creatures, while increased recreational activity brought more potential witnesses into contact with them. Park rangers reported a significant increase in unusual encounter reports, though official policy continued to discourage public discussion of the phenomenon. Dr. Matthew Johnson, a clinical psychologist and experienced outdoorsman, had an encounter in the Olympic Peninsula that would transform him from skeptic to advocate. In 2000, while hiking with his family in the park's interior, Johnson observed a large bipedal creature watching them from approximately 80 yards away. The creature was clearly non-human, but demonstrated obvious intelligence, observing the family for several minutes before disappearing into dense forest. Johnson's encounter was significant because of his professional background and credibility. As a licensed psychologist with no previous interest in cryptozoology, he had no motivation to fabricate the encounter. His detailed description matched classic Bigfoot characteristics, but his professional training allowed him to analyze his own psychological state and rule out hallucination or misperception. The encounter changed Johnson's life and career trajectory. He began researching similar cases, eventually becoming one of the most vocal and controversial advocates for Bigfoot reality. His transformation from skeptic to believer demonstrates the powerful impact these encounters have on witnesses, particularly those with scientific training who understand the implications of what they've observed. Trail camera technology revolutionized evidence collection during this period. Hunters and researchers began deploying networks of motion-activated cameras in areas with regular sighting activity. These cameras operated continuously, capturing thousands of images and videos of wildlife activities in remote forest areas. Occasionally, they captured something that defied easy explanation. The Marble Mountain footage, captured by a hunter's trail camera in Northern California in 2001, shows a large, dark figure walking upright through dense forest. The figure's proportions and movement patterns are unlike any known animal in the region, and the remote camera location makes deliberate hoaxing unlikely. Analysis of the footage suggests a creature approximately 8 feet tall, with arm proportions and gait characteristics consistent with theoretical bipedal primate adaptations. Their purpose, but trail camera evidence also revealed the creature's apparent awareness of surveillance technology. Cameras placed in areas with regular creature sign often captured images of the devices being carefully examined or repositioned. Some cameras were found pointed at empty spaces rather than game trails, suggesting intelligent manipulation by creatures that understood their purpose. This technological awareness had profound implications for research methodology. The creatures weren't just avoiding human contact. They were actively countering human attempts at documentation. This suggested intelligence sophisticated enough to understand cause and effect relationships between human technology and potential exposure. The internet transformed how encounter reports were collected and analyzed. Websites dedicated to Bigfoot research allowed witnesses to file detailed reports, often within hours of their experiences. This immediate documentation reduced the possibility of memory distortion and created databases containing thousands of encounters with unprecedented detail and geographic precision. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, founded by Matt Moneymaker in 1995, became the primary repository for encounter reports in North America. Their database contains over 5,000 reports from across the continent, each classified according to encounter type, evidence quality, and witness credibility. Analysis of this data revealed patterns that supported the biological reality hypothesis, while identifying obvious hoaxes and misidentifications. Geographic analysis of the BFRO database showed that encounters clustered in specific habitat types: temperate forests with adequate water sources, minimal human development, and abundant wildlife populations. These habitat preferences were consistent with large omnivore requirements, supporting the idea that encounters represented genuine biological phenomena rather than cultural mythology. Temporal analysis revealed seasonal patterns consistent with animal behavior. Encounter frequencies peaked during late summer and fall, when natural food sources were most abundant. This timing also corresponded with increased human activity in remote areas, but the strength of the seasonal signal suggested biological rather than simply observational factors. The database also revealed behavioral consistency across thousands of reports. Creatures were described as curious but cautious, intelligent but non-aggressive, and possessing obvious awareness of human capabilities and limitations. These behavioral patterns remained consistent across different geographic regions, time periods, and witness backgrounds, suggesting genuine species characteristics rather than cultural expectation. DNA analysis emerged as a potential game changer during this period. Hair samples, blood traces, and other biological materials allegedly from creatures were subjected to sophisticated genetic testing. Most samples proved to be from known animals, but some returned results that couldn't be easily explained or classified. Dr. Melba Ketchum, a forensic scientist with extensive DNA analysis experience, spent 5 years analyzing samples allegedly from Bigfoot encounters. Her results, published in 2012, claimed to identify a previously unknown hominin species with both human and non-human genetic characteristics. The findings suggested creatures that were genetically related to humans, but represented a distinct evolutionary branch. Ketchum's research was immediately controversial. Mainstream scientists criticized her methodology, sample handling procedures, and conclusions. The journal that published her findings was accused of inadequate peer review. The scientific community largely rejected her claims, but some researchers continue to argue that her results deserve more serious consideration. The controversy surrounding DNA evidence highlighted the challenges facing cryptozoological research. Standard scientific institutions were reluctant to investigate claims that challenged accepted theories about human evolution and North American natural history. Researchers working on creature evidence found themselves isolated from mainstream science, making rigorous peer review and institutional support difficult to obtain. But technological advances continued to provide new investigative tools. Thermal imaging cameras allowed researchers to detect heat signatures in complete darkness, potentially revealing creatures that remained invisible to conventional observation. Sound analysis equipment could identify vocalizations outside normal human hearing ranges, detecting communication that might otherwise be missed. The Sierra sounds, recorded by Ron Moorhead in the 1970s, but enhanced with digital technology in the 2000s, revealed complex vocalizations that linguists claimed showed language-like properties. The sounds demonstrated structure, repetition, and variation consistent with communication rather than simple animal calls. Some researchers argued that these recordings provided evidence for sophisticated intelligence and cultural transmission. Video analysis software allowed frame-by-frame examination of encounter footage, revealing details that weren't visible to the naked eye. The Patterson-Gimlin film was subjected to increasingly sophisticated analysis, with researchers examining muscle movement, hair patterns, and biomechanical details that weren't detectable when the film was originally shot. Motion capture technology, borrowed from the entertainment industry, allowed comparison between reported creature movements and known human and animal locomotion patterns. This analysis suggested that creatures described in encounters moved in ways that were biomechanically distinct from humans, supporting claims that encounters involved unknown species rather than people in costumes. But perhaps the most significant development of the digital age was the democratization of research. High-quality investigation tools became available to amateur researchers, while internet communication allowed coordination and information sharing across vast distances. The exclusive domain of academic science was being challenged by citizen scientists armed with sophisticated technology and passionate dedication. This democratization had mixed results. It increased the volume of research and evidence collection dramatically, but it also reduced quality control and peer review. Anyone with a camera and internet access could contribute to the field, making it difficult to separate serious research from entertainment-focused content. The proliferation of hoaxes and staged encounters also increased dramatically during this period. The popularity of Bigfoot-themed television shows created financial incentives for fabricating evidence, while digital technology made creating convincing fake footage easier than ever before. Researchers struggled to develop protocols for distinguishing genuine evidence from increasingly sophisticated hoaxes. Despite these challenges, the digital age produced more potential evidence for the creature's existence than all previous periods combined. Whether this evidence will eventually prove their reality or demonstrate the power of modern hoax technology remains to be seen. But the volume and variety of material available for analysis has transformed the field from folklore study to potential wildlife biology. The creatures themselves seem to adapt to the digital age, just as they had adapted to previous technological developments. Encounter reports suggested that they had learned to avoid areas with heavy camera deployment, to recognize and circumvent motion sensors, and to understand the implications of being photographed or filmed. Their apparent intelligence continued to stay one step ahead of human documentation efforts. In the shadow of skepticism and scientific dismissal, a dedicated community of researchers has spent decades pursuing evidence of North America's most elusive inhabitants. These modern hunters combine cutting-edge technology with old-fashioned woodcraft, forensic science with indigenous wisdom, approaching their quarry with respect, patience, and an understanding that they may be seeking something far more complex than a simple animal. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum stands at the intersection of academic science and cryptozoological research. As a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, Meldrum risks his professional reputation every time he speaks publicly about his Bigfoot research. But the evidence he's collected over 2 decades has convinced him that the phenomenon deserves serious scientific investigation, regardless of the professional costs. Meldrum's expertise in primate locomotion and foot anatomy provides unique insights into Bigfoot tracks and movement patterns. His analysis of casts from various locations reveals consistent anatomical features that would be nearly impossible to fake convincingly. Foot flexibility, toe proportions, and pressure patterns that suggest adaptations for bipedal locomotion in forest environments. The track evidence tells a story of evolutionary adaptation. The creature's feet show characteristics that would be expected in bipedal primates adapted for forest travel. Broader than human feet for stability on uneven terrain, more flexible for grip on various surfaces, and with toe arrangements optimized for both power and precision. These aren't enlarged human feet or simple animal tracks, but evidence of unique evolutionary solutions to the challenges of upright locomotion in wilderness environments. Meldrum's research extends beyond simple track analysis. He's studied reported vocalizations, analyzed hair samples, and investigated behavioral patterns described in encounter reports. His conclusion, based on decades of research, is that the evidence points toward an unknown primate species, a relict hominid that has survived in North American forests through sophisticated behavioral adaptations. But academic scientists working on cryptozoological subjects face unique challenges. Meldrum has been criticized by colleagues, questioned by university administrators, and excluded from certain professional opportunities. The stigma associated with Bigfoot research creates pressure to abandon the investigation or risk career advancement. That serious scientists continue working in this field despite these pressures speaks to the compelling nature of the evidence they've encountered. Cliff Barackman represents a different approach to creature research. As a musician and jazz educator turned full-time Bigfoot investigator, Barackman combines artistic sensitivity with scientific rigor. His approach emphasizes understanding the creatures as intelligent beings rather than simple animals, looking for patterns of behavior that suggest culture and learning rather than just instinct. Barackman's research focuses on evidence that suggests tool use and environmental modification. He's documented instances where trees appear to have been deliberately twisted or broken in ways that create territorial markers or travel aids. These modifications require significant strength and appear to follow consistent patterns across different geographic areas, suggesting cultural transmission of techniques rather than random behavior. The tree breaks present particularly intriguing evidence. The modifications often occur at heights that would require extraordinary reach or climbing ability, in patterns that seem to serve communication or navigation purposes. Similar markings appear along what researchers have identified as potential travel corridors, suggesting systematic modification of the environment to facilitate movement and communication. Barackman also investigates structures that appear to be deliberately constructed by unknown agents. These formations typically involve arranged logs, stones, or branches that create shelters, blinds, or markers. While some can be explained by natural processes or human activity, others occur in locations and configurations that suggest non-human intelligence with different architectural preferences than our own. The structures often show sophisticated understanding of engineering principles, weight distribution, stability, and weatherproofing achieved through techniques that differ from both animal nest building and human construction methods. They appear designed for temporary use by large-bodied creatures who understand structural principles but apply them according to different aesthetic and functional priorities. Matt Moneymaker's Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization has become the primary coordinating body for creature research in North America. BFRO expeditions bring together experienced investigators and interested newcomers, combining systematic search techniques with educational outreach. Their approach emphasizes patience, respect, and the understanding that successful encounters require earning the creature's trust, rather than simply hunting them like animals. BFRO expeditions follow protocols developed over decades of field experience. Participants learn to recognize sign, understand behavioral patterns, and conduct themselves in ways that minimize disruption to creature activities. The approach treats encounters as opportunities for mutual observation rather than capture attempts, respecting the creature's obvious intelligence and desire for privacy. The organization's database represents the most comprehensive collection of encounter reports in existence. Analysis of this data reveals patterns that support biological rather than mythological explanations for the phenomenon. Geographic distributions follow habitat requirements, behavioral descriptions remain consistent across regions and time periods, and seasonal patterns match wildlife activity cycles. But perhaps most significantly, the database reveals the human impact on creature behavior. Sightings decrease dramatically in areas that receive significant media attention or heavy research pressure. The creatures appear to understand the connection between human attention and potential threat, adjusting their activities accordingly. This intelligence suggests that successful research requires approaches that respect the creatures, desire for privacy, and minimize disruption to their established patterns. Bobo Fay brings a unique perspective as both a commercial fisherman and dedicated researcher. His experience reading water patterns, weather signs, and wildlife behavior translates directly to tracking creatures that have mastered the art of moving undetected through complex forest environments. Faye's approach emphasizes understanding the creature's relationship with their environment, rather than simply searching for direct evidence. Faye's observations suggest that the creatures are deeply integrated into forest ecosystems, playing roles that aren't immediately obvious to human observers. They appear to maintain trails that are used by multiple wildlife species, create clearings that benefit plant and animal communities, and demonstrate knowledge of seasonal patterns that indicates generational accumulation of environmental information. This ecological integration explains why the creatures have remained hidden despite increasing human presence in wilderness areas. They aren't separate from the forest ecosystem. They're essential components of it, understanding environmental relationships that allow them to anticipate and avoid human activities while maintaining their traditional lifestyle patterns. The research community has developed sophisticated techniques for investigating potential evidence without disrupting creature activities. Remote cameras are placed along suspected travel routes, but in ways that minimize visual impact and avoid creating obvious human presence indicators. Sound recording equipment captures vocalizations and movement patterns without requiring direct human observation. Thermal imaging technology allows observation in complete darkness, potentially revealing creatures that remain invisible to conventional detection methods. These systems can detect heat signatures from significant distances, allowing researchers to observe behavior without approaching close enough to cause disturbance. Hair traps use minimal scent attractants and natural materials to collect biological samples without creating obvious human modifications to the environment. When samples are recovered, they're subjected to sophisticated DNA analysis, microscopic examination, and comparison with known species characteristics. But the most important development in modern research may be the growing emphasis on respectful approach. Researchers increasingly understand that they're potentially investigating an intelligent species that deserves consideration as more than a subject for scientific curiosity. This ethical dimension adds complexity to research methods, but may be essential for eventual success. The creature's apparent intelligence suggests that they understand human intentions and motivations. Researchers who approach with aggressive capture mentality seem less likely to succeed than those who demonstrate respect and patience. The most compelling encounters often involve witnesses who were engaged in non-threatening activities, hiking, camping, or working in forest environments without specific creature-seeking intentions. This intelligence also suggests that the creatures have opinions about human researchers and may be making their own decisions about when and where to allow encounters. Some researchers report developing what seems to be ongoing relationships with creature communities, with encounters becoming more frequent and detailed over time as trust develops. Dr. Bindernagel's approach emphasizes treating the creatures as wildlife rather than monsters or mysteries. His background as a wildlife biologist provides framework for understanding behavior patterns, habitat requirements, and ecological relationships that would characterize a large primate species adapted for North American forest environments. Bindernagel argues that the scientific community's rejection of Bigfoot evidence represents institutional bias rather than objective analysis. The evidence for unknown primate presence is substantial and consistent, meeting standards that would be accepted for any other potential species discovery. The rejection stems from preconceptions about what is possible rather than careful evaluation of what has been documented. His research focuses on understanding the creature's role in forest ecosystems and their adaptation strategies for avoiding human detection. These adaptations appear to include sophisticated understanding of human technology, behavior patterns that minimize contact opportunities, and social organization that allows information sharing across large territories. The modern hunting of Bigfoot has evolved far beyond the sensationalism and creature feature mentality that characterized earlier periods. Today's researchers understand that they may be investigating a species with intelligence approaching or possibly exceeding human capabilities. Beings that have successfully remained hidden while human civilization transformed the continent around them. This realization brings both excitement and responsibility. If these creatures exist, their survival may depend on continued secrecy and minimal human interference. Researchers must balance their desire for proof with respect for beings who have chosen invisibility as their primary survival strategy. The evidence continues to accumulate, but so does the creature's apparent sophistication in avoiding documentation. The modern hunt for Bigfoot has become less about finding monsters in the woods and more about understanding our relationship with intelligence that chose a different path than human civilization. As we reach the end of our journey through the untold history of Bigfoot, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a mystery that has grown deeper, not clearer, with each passing decade. We've traced the phenomenon from ancient tribal memories through gold rush encounters, from government files through digital age evidence. We've seen patterns of intelligence, adaptation, and awareness that challenge our understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be wild, and what it means to share this continent with beings who have chosen a radically different path than our own. The evidence is substantial and growing. Thousands of encounters across centuries of time, physical traces that defy easy explanation, behavioral patterns that suggest intelligence and cultural transmission, government files that reveal official interest far beyond casual curiosity, DNA samples that hint at unknown genetic relationships, and through it all, the consistent thread of beings who understand our world well enough to remain invisible within it. But perhaps the most compelling evidence isn't in the tracks, the hair samples, or the blurry photographs. Perhaps it lies in the transformation of witnesses, the way ordinary people's lives are forever changed by brief encounters with something extraordinary. These aren't people seeking fame or fortune. They're hunters and hikers, loggers and rangers, families on camping trips, and scientists conducting research. They share the look of people who have seen something that expanded their understanding of what's possible in this world. The creatures themselves remain as mysterious as ever, but their relationship with humanity has evolved dramatically. They've adapted to our technology, learned to avoid our cameras, and demonstrated intelligence that stays consistently one step ahead of our efforts to document their existence. They seem to understand that their survival depends on remaining hidden, and they've proven remarkably successful at maintaining that secrecy. This intelligence raises profound questions about consciousness, rights, and our responsibility as the dominant species on this planet. If these beings exist, if they possess the intelligence that encounters suggest, then what obligations do we have toward them? Do they have rights to the forests they've inhabited far longer than we've inhabited this continent? Are we obligated to protect their privacy, their territory, their choice to remain separate from human civilization? The government files suggest that officials have been grappling with these questions for decades. The secrecy, the careful documentation, the apparent efforts to prevent sensationalism all point toward people in positions of authority who understand the implications of what they're dealing with. Whether they're protecting scientific research, covering up inconvenient discoveries, or simply trying to prevent panic. Their behavior suggests that the phenomenon is being taken far more seriously than public statements indicate. As technology continues to advance, maintaining secrecy becomes increasingly difficult. Satellite surveillance can monitor vast wilderness areas. GPS tracking records human movement in unprecedented detail. Motion-activated cameras operate continuously in remote locations. Genetic analysis can identify species relationships from microscopic samples. The digital age has created an environment where truly unknown species become harder to conceal. Yet the creatures have adapted to each technological advance, demonstrating awareness and intelligence that allows them to stay ahead of human detection capabilities. Their success suggests not just animal cunning, but sophisticated understanding of cause and effect, technology and its implications, human behavior and motivation. They seem to know us better than we know them. This asymmetric relationship may be the key to understanding the entire phenomenon. We are the observed, not the observers. We are the subjects of study, not the researchers. The creatures watch us, learn from us, and adapt their behavior based on understanding of our capabilities and limitations. They have turned the tables on humanity's attempt to catalog and control the natural world. The tribal traditions that began our journey may have had it right from the beginning. These aren't monsters or animals or evolutionary throwbacks. They're people who made different choices, who adapted to life in the wild spaces while we adapted to life in cities and farms and towns. They represent the path not taken, the option we abandoned when we chose civilization over wilderness. Their continued existence suggests that our path, for all its benefits and achievements, may not have been the only viable option. Intelligence and consciousness can adapt to environments in ways we never considered. Social organization, technology, and culture can develop along lines completely different from human patterns. The creatures represent not what we were, but what we might have become if we had made different choices. Whether they're relict hominids, unknown primates, or something else entirely, may be less important than what their existence means for our understanding of intelligence, consciousness, and our place in the natural world. They challenge our assumptions about evolution, about the development of intelligence, about the relationship between civilization and wisdom. The search continues, driven by curiosity, wonder, and the fundamental human need to understand our world and our place within it. Each new piece of evidence adds to our knowledge while deepening the mystery. Each encounter transforms another person's understanding of what's possible. Each generation of researchers brings new tools and new perspectives to the investigation. But perhaps the greatest value of the Bigfoot phenomenon isn't in eventually proving or disproving the creature's existence. Perhaps it lies in what the search teaches us about ourselves, about our relationship with the natural world, about the limits of our knowledge and the vastness of what we still don't understand. In a world where we often believe we've cataloged and controlled everything, the possibility that something large and intelligent remains hidden in our forests is both humbling and inspiring. The question that opened our journey remains unanswered. Are we sharing this continent with beings that have been watching us for thousands of years? The evidence suggests we might be. The implications of that possibility will continue to challenge and inspire us for generations to come. Tonight, somewhere in the deep forests of North America, something moves between the trees. Something intelligent, aware, and intentionally hidden from our increasingly connected and monitored world. Whether it's real or imagined, whether it's flesh and blood or hope and mystery, it continues to call to something deep in the human spirit that remembers when the world was larger and more mysterious than we can now imagine. The search for Bigfoot is ultimately the search for wonder, for possibility, for the magic that exists at the edges of our understanding. In that search, perhaps we find not just evidence of unknown creatures, but evidence of our own capacity for hope, curiosity, and connection to mysteries that may forever remain beyond our complete comprehension. The forest keeps its secrets, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. What do you believe? The evidence is before you. The witnesses have spoken, the files have been opened. In a world where satellites can count the trees and cameras watch empty clearings, is there still room for mystery? Is there still space for beings who choose the shadows over the spotlight, privacy over publicity, the ancient ways over the modern world? The answer may be walking silently through the forests tonight, leaving no trace except in the hearts and minds of those who glimpse something extraordinary moving between the trees.